Chapter 15. The summer was nearly over. Sheaves of wheat were stacked in the fields. The peasants worked as hard as they could, but they did not have enough horses or oxen to bring in the harvest quickly. A high railroad bridge spanned the cliffs of a big river near the village. It was guarded by heavy guns, set in concrete pillboxes. At night, when high-flying airplanes droned in the sky, everything on the bridge was blacked out. In the morning, life resumed. Soldiers in helmets manned the guns, and from the highest point of the bridge, the angular form of the swastika, woven in its flag, twisted in the wind. On hot night, gunfire was heard in the distance. The muffled sound washed over the fields, alarming men and birds. Flashes of lightning twinkled far away. People assembled in front of their houses. The men, smoking their corncob pipes, watched the man-made lightning and said, "The front is coming." Others added, "The Germans are losing." Many arguments broke out. Some of the peasants said that when the Soviet commissars came, they would distribute the land fairly to everyone, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. It would be the end of exploiting landlords or corrupt officials and brutal policemen. Others violently disagreed, swearing on the Holy Cross that shouted that the Soviets would nationalize everything right down to the wives and children. They looked at the glare of the eastern sky and swore that the coming of the Reds meant that people would turn away from the altar, forget the teachings of the ancestors, and give themselves up to sinful lives, until God, justice, made them pillars of salt. Brother fought against brother. Fathers swung axes against fathers in front of their sons. An invisible force divided people, split families, addled brains. Only the elders remained sane, scurrying from one side to the other, begging the combatants to make peace. They cried in their squeaky voices that there was enough war in the world without starting one in the village. The thunder beyond the horizon was coming nearer. It rolled cool in the quarrels. People suddenly forgot about Soviet commissars or divine wrath in their rush to dig pits in their barns and cellars. They hid stores of butter, pork, and calf's meat, rye, and wheat. Some secretly dyed sheets red for use as flags to greet the new rulers, while others hid away in safe places crucifixes, the figures of Jesus and Mary, and icons. I did not understand all of it, but I sensed the urgency in the air. No one paid any attention to me anymore. I wandered among the huts, hearing sounds of digging, nervous whispers and prayers. As I lay in the field with my ear to the ground, I could hear a distant thudding sound. Was it the Red Army coming? The throbbing in the earth was like a heartbeat. I was wondering why, if God could make sinners into pillars of salt so easily, salt was so expensive. And why didn't he turn some sinners into meat or sugar? The villagers certainly needed these as much as salt. I lay on my back and looked in the clouds. They floated by in such a way that I myself seemed to be floating. If it was true that women and children might become communal property, then every child would have made fathers and mothers, innumerable brothers and sisters. It seemed to me too much to hope for, to belong to everyone. Wherever I might go, my fathers would stroke my head with warm, reassuring hands. Many mothers would hug me in their bosoms, and many older brothers would defend me against dogs. And I would have to look after my smaller brothers and sisters. There seemed to be no reason for the peasants to be so afraid. The cloud dissolved into one another, becoming now darker, now lighter. Somewhere high above them, God directed it all. I understood now why he could hardly spare time for a small black flea like me. He had vast armies, countless men, animals, who was he had decided who was to win and who was to lose, who was to live and who was to die. But if God really decided what to happen, why did the peasants worry about their faith, the churches, and the clergy? If the Soviet commissars really intended to destroy the churches, desecrate the altars, kill the priests, and persecute the faithful, the Red Army would not have the remotest chance of winning the war. Even the most overworked God could not overlook such a menace to his people, who also demolished churches and murdered people. But then would not that mean that the Germans, who also demolished churches and murdered people, would prove the winners? From God's point of view, it seemed to make more sense if everyone lost the war, since everyone was committing murder. Common ownership of wives and children, the peasant said. It sounded rather mysterious. Anyway, I thought, with a little goodwill, the Soviet commissars might perhaps include me among the children. Although I was smaller, and most 8-year-old boys, I was almost 11 now, and it disturbed me that the Russians might classify me as an adult, or at least not regard me as a child. In addition, I was a mute. I also had trouble with food, which sometimes came up from my stomach undigested. I surely deserved to become common property. One morning, I noticed unusual activity on the bridge. Helmeted soldiers were swarming over it, dismantling the cannon and machine guns, hauling down the German flag. As large trucks went westward from the other side of the bridge, the harsh sound of the German songs faded. "They are running away," said the peasants. "They have lost the war," whispered the bolder ones. Next day, at noon, a band of mounted men rode into the village. There was 100 of them, perhaps more. They seemed to be one with their horses. They rode with marvelous ease, without any set order. They were green German uniforms with bright buttons, and forage caps pulled down over their eyes. The peasants instantly recognized them. They screamed in terror that the Kalmucks were coming, and that the women and the children must hide before they could be seized. For months, in the village, many terrible tales had been told about the riders, usually described as Kalmucks. The peasants said that when the one invincible German army had occupied a large area of Soviet land, it was joined by many Kalmucks, mostly volunteers, deserters from the Soviets. Hating the Reds, they joined the Germans, who permitted them to loot and rape the manor in their war customs and manly traditions. This is why the Kalmucks were sent to the village and towns that were to be punished for some non-compliance, and particularly to those towns that lay in the path of the advancing Red Army. The Kalmucks rode at full gallop, bent over their horses, using their spurs and uttering hoarse cries. Under their unbuttoned uniforms one could see bare brown skin. Some rode without saddles, some carried heavy sabers on their belts. Wild confusion seized the village. It was too late for flight. I looked at the horsemen with keen interest. They all had black oily hair which glistened in the sun, almost blue-black. It was even darker than mine, as were also their eyes and their swarthy skins. They had large white teeth, high cheekbones, and wide faces that looked swollen. For a moment, as I looked at them, I felt great pride and satisfaction. After all, these proud horsemen were black-haired, black-eyed, and dark-skinned. They differed from the people of the village as night from day. The arrival of these dark Kalmucks drove the fair-headed village people almost insane with fear. In the meantime, the riders pulled up their horses between the houses. One of them, a squat man in the fully buttoned uniform and the officer's cap, shouted orders. They jumped off their horses and tied them up to fences. From their saddles they took pieces of meat that had been cooked by heat of the horse and rider. They ate these blue-gray meat with their hands and drank out of gourds, coughing and spluttering as they swallowed. Some were already drunk. They rushed to the huts and grabbed the women who were not hidden. The men tried to defend them with their sickles. A Kalmuk cut down one of them with a single stroke of his saber. Others tried to run away, but were stopped by a revolver shot. The Kalmuk scattered through the village. The air was filled with screams from every quarter. I rushed into the middle of the small, thick cluster of raspberry bushes, right at the center of the square, and flattened myself like a worm. As I watched carefully, the village exploded in panic. Men tried to defend the houses, which Kalmuks had already entered. More shots rang out, and the men wounded in the head around the circle, blinded by his own blood. A Kalmuk cut him down. The children scattered wildly, stumbling over ditches and fences. One of them ran into the bushes where I was hiding, but seeing me, ran out again to be trampled by galloping horses. The Kalmuks were now dragging a half-naked woman out of a house. She struggled and screamed, trying in vain to catch her tormentors by the legs. A group of women and girls were being rounded up with horsewhips by some laughing riders. The fathers, husbands, and brothers of the woman ran about begging for mercy, but were chased away with horsewhips and sabers. A farmer ran through the main street with his hand cut off, blood spurting from the stump while he kept looking for his family. Nearby, the soldiers had forced a woman to the ground. One soldier held her by the throat while others pulled her legs apart. One of them mounted her and moved on top of her to shouts of encouragement. The women struggled and cried. When the first was done, the others assaulted her in turn. The women soon got limp and did not fight back anymore. Still another woman was brought out. She screamed and begged, but the Kalmuks stripped her and threw her on the ground. 2 men raped her at once, one in the mouth. When she tried to twist her head aside or close her mouth, she was lashed with a bullwhip. Finally, she weakened and submitted passively. Some other soldiers were raping from the front and from the back 2 young girls, passing them from one man to the next, forcing them to perform strange movements. When the girl resisted, they were flogged and kicked. The screams of raped women were heard all over the houses. One girl somehow managed to escape and ran out half-naked, with blood streaming down her thighs, howling like a whipped dog. 2 half-naked soldiers ran after her, laughing. They chased her around the square amidst the laughter and jokes of the comrades. Finally they caught up with her. Weeping children looked on. New victims were being caught all the time. The drunken Kalmuks, more and more aroused, became frenzied. Some of the Kalmuks copulated with each other, then competed in raping women in odd ways. 2 or 3 men to one girl, several men in rapid succession. The younger and more desirable girls were nearly torn apart, and some quarrels broke out among the soldiers. The women sobbed and prayed aloud. Their husbands and their fathers, sons and brothers, who were now locked in the houses, recognized their voices and responded with maddened shrieks.